Hey, my name is Aiden, and today I'm going to be talking about emo music. I remember back in high school, I went through this one phase to where I felt different from the rest, is what I can say. I felt like, oh, they don't understand what I'm going through. They don't understand, my feelings or what everything is going on in my lifetime. I felt edgy. And that's kind of where I discovered this genre. I discovered bands like My Chemical Romance, Pierce the Veil, Sleeping with Sirens, and other bands like that. But specifically, what is emo music? Well, first things first, emo stands for emotional. We can kind of put the pieces together with that. But more specifically, according to Britannica.com, emo music is a genre of music, more specifically a subgenre of punk music that originated in the 1980s in Washington, D.C. But what was the first emo album and who was the first emo band? Well, there isn't really a clear answer to that. There's kind of two answers to that one question. Basically, we're going to go off the first one of technicalities. Technically, the first emo album was Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Such a strange thing to say, I know, but that's going off technicalities. If we're going to go off actualities, and what most people consider to be the first emo band and the first emo album, will be the first release of the band Rites of Springs in 1984. These guys are considered the fathers of the emo music, but both answers are technically correct, but usually this is a more accepted answer. But what did it sound like? What instruments did they use? What was the vocal style like? What did they use in terms of production quality and stuff like that? Well, according to Masterclass.com, emo music is like a mix of grunge, goth, and alt-rock music all smushed together into one genre. So think of it like Nirvana mixed with Joy Division with like an alt-rock vibe, if that makes any sense at all. Emo music was notorious for using traditional styles of instruments as well. They didn't have a lot of the funds that a lot of the popular bands had at the time. They were a lot of DIY type bands because they were just new, and since it was such a new genre, they didn't have a lot of access to, that nice production quality, those nice studios to record their stuff in. So they had limited funds and they had limited access to everything, so they used what they could. What that means is they used all the basic instruments like guitars, drums, and bass. They didn't use anything complicated like synthesizers or like vocal correction software or anything like that. They did with what they could because they didn't have the funding for it. But in terms of what the music sounded like, really depended on the style of emo music you're listening to, and this is very specific with the vocal styles as well. When I say different styles of emo music, there are different types of emo music basically. You have one emo music that's much more calming, and then you have a little bit of a middle ground between that and then the more intensity type stuff. The nice thing about it is there's a lot of variety involved in the genre. So if you were feeling one thing, you could listen to that. If you're feeling another thing, you could listen to that. So as an example, we'll talk about Page 99 versus American Football. Page 99 was considered one of the first emo bands to arise in much more of the intensity of the original genre. What I mean by that is they focused a lot more on the throat-wrenching vocals, the much more intense and energetic shows, the singing till you're about to pass out on stage type aesthetic, and all that intense stuff. But American Football did not do that. They did not do anything like that. They focused a lot more on the complex music composition of their music, interesting guitar riffs, interesting, drums, bass, and stuff like that. They did still have vocals, and they did still match the same style and, what they were talking about with Page 99, but they were much more laid back, much more tame, and much more calm. Still considered both are part of the emo genre, they're just completely separate from what they were talking about, from what they sounded like. But more specifically, what did they talk about in their music? Well, first things first, emotions. They talked a lot about their emotions. That makes sense. We understand that. But more specifically, what did they talk about? They talked about loss. They talked about sadness. They talked about their mental health issues. And they talked about all this other stuff. But more so, it really depended on what the band or whoever was writing the lyrics was feeling at the time. If the person who was writing the lyrics, was in a deep hole and they were feeling awful and they didn't like who they were, they would talk about that, and the music reflected on how they were feeling. It was much more dark and much more sad compared to if they were feeling more, at the highlight of the life, oh, they're living the dream type deal. They're just gonna sing about being on top of the world type deal. Both are, again, still considered part of the emo genre. It just really comes down to how the vocalist or whoever was writing lyrics was feeling. But what about now? Well, from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, there was a relative falling out of the genre. Not saying it wasn't being made still. What I mean by that is people lost interest. Paramore, Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Panic at the Disco either shifted to a different genre, more of a poppy type deal, or straight up split up and didn't make music anymore, which is what My Chemical Romance did. But that begs the question, Where is it at now? Well, at the time of this recording of the video, bands like Into It, Over It, Modern Baseball, Title Flight are still making music that still focuses on the root of the emo genre. What I mean by that is they still use that, basic guitars, bass, and drums. They don't use any of that complicated, synthesizers like I was stating earlier. They still don't have the funds, nor do they have like the connections that a lot of the popular bands nowadays do as well. And they choose to do this. They probably could use that instrumentals, like the higher quality stuff if they wanted to, but they just like making this genre of music. And they're trying to stick with the roots with what they can. But more specifically, why is this different compared to how it was before? It's still using that DIY aesthetic and it's still using the same instruments. But it focuses a lot more on a laid-back indie style vibe. So like American football, like I was stating, they're relatively newer and they are still making music. But they focus more of like, a laid-back and more of an indie rock aesthetic. They focus more on the instrumentals, a lesser intense vocal delivery. They focus much more on singing instead of screaming type deal. And it's just considerably different from how it started to where it is now. So in conclusion, obviously emo music has changed a considerable amount since when it first started. Bands like Rites of Sprigs from the 1980s to Modern Baseball in the mid-2010s are considerably different from considerably different from each other. They went from being popular to not being popular to being like an underground revival in the 2010s. And at this point, it doesn't really seem like emo music is eventually going to die out, and it seems like it's on a steady incline in terms of popularity. Thank you very much. Bye.